welcome to the fifth and final day of the 20th annual enrichment workshop on modern Israel from CIE and ISME. I'm Michael Jacobs. I work with CIE doing communication stuff. For purposes of today's discussion, spent most of my career as a newspaper editor, a couple of times with the Atlanta Jewish Times, and I also serve on the Jewish Community Relations Council of Atlanta. So today we're going to talk about the differences between teaching content about Israel, teaching advocacy, what are the reasons for doing one or the other. We're going to rely on the insights of two people who have operated at the intersection of content and advocacy for a long time. Steve Boehm retired last year from American Jewish Committee, where he was director of the Contemporary Jewish Life and worked with the Koppelman Institute on American Jewish-Israeli relations. Steve last night talked about framing the relationship between American Jews and Israel, between Peter Beinart's The Crisis of Zionism, Daniel Gordis's We Stand Divided, the differences between one community that's universalist and has to worry about continuity and another one that's particularist and is focused on survival. So great insights last night. After Steve, we'll turn to Cheryl Fishbein for the first response. She's president of the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York, former chair of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, which is the umbrella organization for all these JCRCs around the country. Steve?
Issues of advocacy, dissent, how they compare with education, very much in the air right now. Some of you may have seen during the Gaza war, 95 rabbinical students at the liberal seminaries took out a statement protesting Israel's actions. They used very strong language of apartheid. Clearly, that was almost the kind of red flag for many others to say what's being taught regarding Israel at rabbinical seminaries. By the same token, if you saw this morning's E-Jewish Philanthropy, Professor Brandeis makes the argument that dissent does not mean distancing, that on the contrary, some of the people that are most dissenting regarding Israel's policies are the ones most attached to Israel as a Jewish state. So these issues are very much in the air. The charges made by Professor Boxer this morning at an E-Jewish Philanthropy that the Jewish establishment does not welcome dissent, that it's interested only in Israel advocacy or pro-Israel advocacy. It's not interested in real Jewish education or real Israel education. I'd like to address this really from three different perspectives. Number one, understand exactly where the establishment is coming from. By that, I mean the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations and AIPAC are the two major wings of that establishment. Are they receptive to dissent? What forms of dissent are legitimate? What forms of dissent are regarded as illegitimate? I'd then like to turn to the actual classroom and say, what exactly are we teaching? What should we be teaching? What are the goals of Israel education? What do we hope to accomplish? Let me begin really with the issue of what is the establishment. AIPAC was established in 1954 as a registered lobby on behalf of the state of Israel. Clearly, its primary aim as a lobbyist, if you will, is you make the case for your client. Issues of nuance, issues of what we might call education, largely speaking, are a backdrop. The argument is there's no advocacy without content. Namely, the advocates have to be seriously grounded in the content of Israel education, but what they're about is pro-Israel advocacy. The Conference of Presidents has made this more explicit by saying, our job is to defend the policies of the legitimately elected government of the state of Israel, whether that government is of the right or of the left. It was established 1 year later, in 1955. Actually, the stimulus came from the US State Department. The Undersecretary of State argued very simply that the president cannot afford to hear 6 different opinions regarding Israel. You guys get together, sit down, figure out what you want to say, and then I'll make sure you get in to see the president. Jewish organizations radiated or resonated to that viewpoint largely out of historical memory, that they remember the 1930s, when you had a plethora of Jewish organizations descending on Washington, each with its own program of rescue and relief. The upshot was attenuated Jewish political response because of disunity regarding the issue. The Conference of Presidents was organized in 1955 around the principle that on the one issue of Israel, whatever our disagreements are about one or another matter of Israeli policy, our job in Washington is defense of that policy. Has this been successful? Clearly, 75 years of Israel's existence, the Conference of Presidents, AIPAC, played an enormous role in strengthening, establishing, if you will, the special relationship between the United States and Israel. This was particularly evident during the 67 war, subsequently during the 73 war, but whatever the ups and downs of US policy towards Israel has been over 75 years, there's no comparing it with that of other liberal democracies, say Britain, France, Germany, wonderful countries, if you will, but the special relationship between the United States and Israel is very much a function of a strong, vibrant, active, pro-Israel American Jewish community. That position of the Conference of Presidents, namely that on the one issue of Israel we stand united, is a highly unpopular position among public intellectuals, among academics, among college students. In other words, it runs counter to the sense of nuance, wrestling with issues, dissent, if you will, that is widespread on the rank and file levels. In other words, you have the establishment saying what we need is advocacy rather than dissent. What you have on the rank and file levels is, wait a second, these issues are much more complicated. What we were taught in the classroom is far more nuanced than what we're hearing coming out of the mouths of Jewish leaders. And again, Boxer put this point, I think, very effectively this morning in saying that it's not that the establishment opposes dissent, but it's not particularly receptive or friendly to it. So therefore, you have a counter vision emanating primarily in the last 20 years, although you had some of it beforehand as well, that is basically saying that Israel advocacy is under assault, or it ought to be under assault, because it simply parrots the views of the government of Israel, and that government of Israel has been drifting rightward for quite some time. The sources of that counter narrative, I would suggest, are threefold, both within the Jewish community and in general American society. Within the Jewish community, the 1990s witnessed the emergence of post-Zionism. Post-Zionism is a complicated phenomenon. It includes things like the new history, claiming that Israel was born in sin, namely the refugee problem, includes things like the new archaeology, namely that there's no material evidence of Jewish presence in the land of Israel as far back as biblical times. Politically, it seeks to define Israel not as a Jewish state, but as a state of all of its citizens. And the symbols of that state, Hatikva is the national anthem, the law of return, that the symbols of that state give special privilege to Jews. Post-Zionists, effectively, are calling for transformation of the state of Israel from a Jewish state to a secular democratic state. Leave that aside for a second. Its overriding principle is what's critical here. That post-Zionists, initially within Israel, argued that the entire relationship with American Jewry retards Israel's advance into the 21st century. Namely, what must Israel do in the 21st century? According to the post-Zionists, it needs to integrate itself into the region in which it is located. That's a Middle Eastern region with Middle Eastern values and culture. The relationship with diaspora Jewry generally, and American Jewry specifically, retards the process of integration because American Jews, and European Jews for that matter, do not share the values of the Middle Eastern region. The best exponent of this position, most outspoken one, clearly in recent years, has been Avram Borg, who actually a former chairman of the Jewish Agency, in other words, a card-carrying Zionist. But in recent years, he shifted to a post-Zionist position. You might want to read his autobiography, simply called In Days to Come, in which he makes this case that Israel should not be a Jewish state, but rather a state of all of its citizens. That is one assault on pro-Israel advocacy. Namely, American Jews should not be busy advocating for Israel because the entire relationship between American Jewry and Israel retards the process of integration into the Middle East. In the United States, you have a very different view that ends up in the same place of an assault on pro-Israel advocacy. The view has been best represented by two non-Jewish American academics, Stephen Walt of Harvard, John Mearsheimer of University of Chicago, picked up on in other circles, namely that American foreign policy is being held hostage, not to American interests, which is where it belongs, but to the interests of the state of Israel. Why is that the case? Walt and Mearsheimer's book is called The Israel Lobby, namely that pro-Israel advocacy is holding hostage American foreign policy. This view has been picked up on to some extent by leading politicians, initially by former President Carter. His book called Peace, Not Apartheid put aside the title, which was particularly inflammatory. Publishers like to sell books. The real thrust of the book was something else, namely that all of America's troubles in the Middle East are a result of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Therefore, solve the conflict and you'll solve all of America's problems in the Middle East. Most would argue this is a reductionist fallacy, namely, if Israel somehow did not exist tomorrow, you would still have conflict over limited oil supplies. You would still have conflict within the Arab world between Shiites and Sunnis. You'd still have the threat of an Iranian nuclear bomb. But what Carter did was reduce America's troubles in the Middle East to the Arab-Israeli conflict. In that context, for Carter, pro-Israel advocacy is a chief villain in promoting this, because not that the Jews don't have a right to advocate, but a one-sided American foreign policy maximizes the Arab-Israeli conflict out of all proportion and makes it impossible to resolve that conflict. In very recent days, Congressman Ilhan Omar has also picked up on this argument. Her famous quote about it's all about the Benjamins, meaning that Jewish money channeled via AIPAC to politicians, that Jewish money is holding hostage American foreign policy. One comment before you either digest that or throw your hands up in despair. One comment is just bear in mind that 97% of pro-Israel support in this country comes from Gentile sources rather than Jewish sources. In other words, just think about it in demographic terms. Jews are less than 2% of the population. Therefore, by definition, they can't be more than 3% of the pro-Israel support. 97% of that support is coming not from a Jewish lobby, but rather a very pro-Israel Gentile public opinion, which is the greatness of the United States, that since 1948, Israel has enjoyed very high ratings within the American public. Perhaps that's declined a bit in recent years, certainly in certain sectors of America, but fundamentally, America remains a very pro-Israel society. The third source of this assault on pro-Israel advocacy comes from an advocacy organization, namely J Street. J Street was established on the principle that the road to peace lies through Washington. In order for Washington to do the job, it needs to adopt a more even-handed policy towards Israel and the Middle East. Pro-Israel advocacy, in this case coming out of AIPAC, J Street argues, again, retards America's ability to act as an honest broker. One he consulted within J Street, the late Stephen P. Cohen, not to be confused with sociologist Stephen M. Cohen. He was by training a psychologist in conflict resolution. He wrote a book a number of years ago called Beyond America's Grasp, in which he argued that America was incapable of making peace because of a variety of forces within America. The last 10 pages are devoted to the American Jewish establishment, arguing that American Jews, American Jewish leadership does not want peace in the Middle East, because as long as there's no peace, they're critical, they're important. Were peace ever to arrive, American Jewish leadership would be of very little political significance. Personally, here again, I find this nonsensical. I worked in establishment organization for close to 4 decades. I can guarantee you there was no Jewish leader of any respectability, either inside that organization or outside of it, that did not want to see peace come in the Middle East. But Cohen's argument became part and parcel of the larger J Street argument that American Jewish leadership, pro-Israel advocacy are obstacles to peace rather than efforts to facilitate a peace process. What does all this mean in terms of the classroom? And how do we then define Israel education, its goals, its purposes? How do we understand the nature of dissent? When is it legitimate? When is it illegitimate? Let me begin with the question of, is dissent legitimate? Again, I think Boxer put it fairly well this morning. In principle, no one is opposed to dissent. The issue is, when is it wise? When is it helpful? When is it unwise? And here I think you need to zero in on specific areas in which dissent gets expressed. One form of dissent that I would argue is completely legitimate is dissent over particular areas of policy, whether it is policy like conversion to Judaism, which is critical to American Jewry, Israeli policies, the Orthodox monopoly, it's not quite a monopoly in principle, but it is in practice, over conversion to Judaism, is something that American Jews feel very deeply about and affects their own status because conversion is so critical to the future of the American Jewish community, given our issues with mixed marriage. Question of West Bank settlements, perhaps not as central to the American Jewish mindset, but an area in which American Jews are deeply concerned because, if nothing else, a lot of their tax dollars, essentially when monies are fungible, tax dollars going to one form of Israeli society can easily then be channeled in terms of West Bank settlements. We saw this during the debate over loan guarantees a generation ago for resettlement of Soviet Jewish immigrants. Dissent over issues, number one, is perfectly natural. Number two, is found every bit as much within Israeli society, and therefore it's to be expected, therefore will be found within the American Jewish community as well. In terms of Israel education, giving a one-sided narrative and say there are no differences over policy is, number one, untrue. There are enormous differences over policy. And number two, not particularly helpful, because once people see that there's another narrative, their response is going to be, we were fed a pack of propaganda. We were not educated. We were told one particular narrative. When I was at AJC, we hired a brand new staff person, a very young woman, directly out of an Ivy League university, but she attended 13 years of Jewish day school. On one of her first days on the job, I happened to ask her, well, how do you feel about the Arab-Israeli conflict? So she said, when I got to college, my only comment was, why were we never taught about any of these things? In other words, that she heard so much on campus that was dissonant with what she had heard in the day school she attended. And she asked simply, why was they never taught about any of this? What is this, a taboo subject I'm not allowed to be exposed to? So dissent over policy, I would suggest, is understandable, in most cases perfectly legitimate. There's a second form of dissent that I would say is legitimate, and that's the issues of dissent over moral concerns. We saw this in recent years inside the American Jewish community, dissent regarding, perhaps less noticeably, the issue of African refugees, where, again, American Jews took a very strong position that was Israel correct in deporting refugees. And this became a very painful issue, again, both within Israeli society and within the American Jewish community. But even more to the point was the dissent that was expressed that aroused enormous opposition from the Israeli government over the issue of the last election, 2019, I guess it was, when Netanyahu made overtures to include the Kahanist Jewish power, Otzma Yehudit party, into his coalition. Kahana represented a moral stain on the American Jewish polity. The notion of legitimating Kahana, 30 years after he's no longer with us and had been delegitimated, evoked a very negative chord within the American Jewish establishment. The prime minister was extremely disturbed by it. American Jews expressed themselves. Israelis often responded by saying unwarranted interference in a domestic Israeli matter. Again, a very divisive issue between American Jewry and Israel. That kind of moral dissent, again, I would say it's understandable, it's natural. If we did not have it, I would argue we're not meeting our moral expectations of ourselves or of our Israeli brethren. But then there's the third type of dissent, and here is where the issue becomes much more clouded, namely dissent that involves the delegitimization of Israel as a Jewish state. The BDS movement is probably the single best illustration of it. That dissent is far more dangerous, number one, because often the dissenters themselves, I mentioned last night, 13% of millennials are supportive of BDS today, or at least sympathetic to it. Possibly a fluid piece of data because they may not know very much about it and they may feel supportive of it today, they may not feel supportive of it tomorrow. But recognize that the BDS movement says Israel is South Africa, and much of South Africa had to be delegitimated as a white racist state. Israel needs to be delegitimated as a colonialist settler state. So here's an example of dissent coming from American Jewish sources, in this case, among the younger cohort, often not rooted in the real issues. In other words, often coming not from an educational point of view, but from an advocacy point of view, with very dire negative implications for Israel's place in the international arena. That said, I want to offer one other guideline, and that is that there's a world of difference between individual dissent and institutional dissent. Individual dissent, we all have our own opinions. We all have our own perspectives. It's only natural that we express them as individuals. But as institutions, we speak for the entire Jewish community, or we speak for our sector of the Jewish community. It's that voice that resonates before circles of power in Washington, where the question is asked, what does American Jewry think? It's that voice which places much greater risk that is American Jewry doing something that is enhancing Israel, or is American Jewry doing something that will damage US-Israel relations? That distinction between individual dissent and institutional dissent is often lost when discussions of dissent take place. What does all this mean? Israel education, and in the classroom, especially on the high school, secondary school level, is often seen from two very different perspectives, or two very different set of goals. Is our goal to prepare them for what they're going to find on the college campus, in which case arm them with the right talking points, give them the right propaganda, or is our goal to deepen attachment to the state of Israel? If it's the former, and we're upfront about that, recognize that it's often going to be dismissed as pure propaganda. Students are very sophisticated today. They can see right through things. John Ruscape had a very important article in E-Jewish Philanthropy. Date was April 21st, 2021. In other words, 2 months ago. The title of the article was Israel Education or Israel Advocacy? Jewish leadership must decide. Jewish leadership collapses the two and says, if you're not good Israel advocates, you're not being well educated. The contrary point of view of that is that there's no effective advocacy without content. For advocacy to be effective, it's got to be rooted in a full understanding of the issues. In which case, what's the point of Israel education? Is it to bring young people down to Washington to rally and demonstrate, as important as that may be? Or is it to deepen their understanding of the issues? That involves nuance. That involves struggling with issues. That involves recognizing that sometimes there are no clear-cut answers. And certainly involves recognizing that Israel is far from perfect. Like any society, it has its strengths and its weaknesses. Part of our problem is that we elevate Israel into a standard of perfection that will not be matched by any other democracy in the current world. Second, if our goal is Israel education, of deepening attachment, then recognize that what flows from that is that you need to hear a variety of different narratives. And the notion that there's one narrative that everyone's going to buy into very quickly will be exploded. In this sense, and this really is my concluding point, there is a place and time for both Israel education and Israel advocacy. There is a purpose of saying, let's go down to Washington and demonstrate. Let's meet with Congress people and lobby. All that requires preparation without question. What it does not belong in, its place is not the Jewish classroom. The classroom should be understood as a place where students need to explore themselves, their personal identity, their relationship to the content of the material. The notion that education ought to be indoctrination here is to do a disservice. The indoctrination, if you will, comes from the totality of the experience. What the course ought to be is an honest, open, if you will, understanding of contrasting narratives, and then let the students make up their own mind as to which narrative they find most compelling. Or as I used to say to my college classes, whenever I taught the course on the Middle East, I used to say, I really don't care how many students agree with me. I do care how many students have thought about these issues and reached their own conclusions, whatever those conclusions may be. I offer that with a caution that many board members would object very vigorously to that kind of statement. They're saying, what are we paying so much money for people to become ambivalent about Israel? I think we're paying so much money for people to become thinking Jews, reflective on Jewish issues, and ultimately having the confidence that they'll reach their own conclusions after a long period of self-introspection and self-understanding.
Cheryl, please, your turn.
It is always so wonderful to hear Steve's pearls of wisdom. It's really joyful. Of course, I end up agreeing with most of what Steve says, a couple of things not. But I'll just take a few minutes, which will give us a chance to have a good discussion. Steve gave a wonderful overview, but I think I'd like to talk about this from more of a personal experience, and maybe we can get some classroom lessons from that. In the sense that I agree with Steve that advocacy before content, it's like ready, shoot, aim. You cannot be a good advocate before you know what you're talking about. And therefore, the content has to be in the classroom. And that's why it's so wonderful. We're talking to teachers here and people who have the opportunity to teach the content. And I live and breathe advocacy. I'm president of the JCRC of New York. It is the biggest JCRC. We have 1.5 million Jews approximately in the New York metropolitan area. We are facing a spike in anti Semitism, the spike in anti Israel. We've got demonstrations, we've got problems all the time, and we're dealing with how do you respond in this day and age. Now, when I grew up, it was very, very easy. I was a child of Holocaust survivors. You knew right from wrong, right? You were always, you had to be on Israel's side, you had to be on your parents' side, you had to deal with the issues of World War II and the rebuilding of the Jewish people. Our narrative was the Exodus. It was Leon Uris. Go watch the movie, go read the book. There was the Holocaust. There was an existential issue for the Jewish people. You created a state, and you had to fight for the state, and you had to be for the state no matter what. We understood the narrative. It was fairly simple. The problem is it's too simplistic for today. Kids now feel, and adults as well, feel like they have to somehow distance themselves from Israel. That it's okay to fight anti-Semitism, but if it comes to fighting for Israel, then it gets too complicated, and people are not well versed in how to respond in a very complicated situations. There are statistics that show now that a majority of young people cannot even name one concentration camp, not even Auschwitz. And what does that show? Does it show a failure on our part? Probably. And certainly a lack of good, solid Jewish education of our history and of what's going on. People sit back and say, oh, Israel is so strong. Israel is always the victor. Israel doesn't need our help anymore. They can manage on their own. There have been articles in the New York Times saying that Israel doesn't need US aid anymore because they are so strong, because they can manage on their own. And so the whole issue of the existential problem of the survival of Israel and the Jewish people is mute now. And that is something we have to really get back to. And what I argue at this point, right now, in this moment in history, is that we are at an inflection point. An opportunity has presented itself that we can become more pro-Israel, better advocates based on our education of Israel and of our history. Meaning, there have been 4 elections in the state of Israel. Well, if that's not a good show of democracy, I'm not really sure what is. And we can talk about the force of democracy. We can school students in this area of Israel democracy, that it is the one country in the Middle East where there is freedom of the press, freedom for women, and all the rest of it. Not in a pure, perfect way, but certainly one of the best functioning democracies, even with the whole mess that's going on there. So when I was at the yeshiva, I went to 12 years of day school. So I was at the yeshiva of Flatbush, which was a modern Orthodox, very, very Zionist school. We knew then what was right and what was wrong. It was easy for us. So when the whole Soviet Jewry issue popped up, I was a young kid in 67 when that popped up. It was easy to say, we know the right answers here. We can go out in the street. We can demonstrate. Let's go to Washington. Right now, people go out and they don't know their responses. They don't know what to say. They don't know how to maneuver the responses, which are very sharp and very direct, and how to talk back and how to be comfortable in saying, I'm a supporter of Israel and I can explain why. Now, the problem also is I'll give you most recently with the conflict in Gaza, together with the whole issue of the spike in anti-Semitism and hate for the Chinese people in New York City. The responses for the JSA, there were many, many requests for rallies, and we're the center of rallies and parades and all the rest of it. And the painful part of this is that we had to respond to the Israelis, that we would not do a rally specifically for Israel, because we knew that we couldn't get people to show up for that. Now, that to me was tragic, but that was the reality of our situation. Had we done a rally to say it's going to be anti-hate, which we did January before the pandemic hit, and we got over 30,000 people walking with us across the Brooklyn Bridge, and it was a no hate rally, and we got everybody on board for that. That we could have done again. But had it been an Israel rally where Israel was arguing this is an existential issue, we couldn't do that. We couldn't do it because we knew 30,000 people would not show up. And we were not going to put all our resources into getting 2,000 people important. But in a city like New York City, in order for something like this to really have an impact and really make a difference, we couldn't do it. And so the issue was so important to me as we were thinking through these things and having discussions every single day during the Gaza conflict of what are we going to do here. It was sad. And we are now at an inflection point where we have to decide, how are we going to do Israel advocacy? How are we going to make sure that the message is out there? And the other thing is that something that years back I would never know, and then I'll finish up because I know we want to talk. One of the issues is our relationship, the Jewish relationship with Israel, Jewish community was like strong and steadfast. And Steve, there was no room for dissent. And the whole idea, I remember the discussions of when people started to say, well, we should be able to have dissent, we should be able to do this. And the response was, maybe quietly in a quiet room amongst ourselves, but certainly not outwardly against Israel, because that will weaken Israel. And we're always dealing with the existential issue of Israel. So if you have something bad to say it quietly and don't let it out. Well, that obviously has weakened, but what has helped weaken it, unfortunately, are the issues that you brought up, Steve. Particularly the issue of conservative and reform conversions, and the who is a Jew issue has infuriated people and allowed people to say, if you're not going to recognize me and my legitimacy as a conservative Jew or reform Jew or whatever, I'm not going to recognize you. It's those kinds of issues that have created conflict between us and the Israelis. And it's something that we have to work on.
Thank you, Cheryl. Steve, you talked about the difference between individual dissent and organizational dissent. And you've talked about David Harris, when the loan guarantees, I think, for the settlements came up 30 years ago, AJC needed to stand with Israel as an organization, provide a united front. 30 years ago, there wasn't Twitter and Facebook and TikTok and Instagram. The dissent is out there for everybody to see every minute of every day. Some of it presented as individuals, some of it individuals as organizations. You can't even tell necessarily whether somebody's an individual or organization. To what extent does that require the establishment to reassess that idea that we need as an organization, as a group, to provide a united front when everybody knows there isn't a united front?
It's a given that there's no united front simply because we're talking about a ton of individuals, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. That should not be surprising to us. Social media has aggravated the situation, I think, in a very different direction, simply because of the absence of nuance, the absence of complexity. You try to do something, 127 characters, or whatever is the latest rule of thumb on Twitter. Don't expect to learn anything. All you're really learning is that people have strong opinions. Sometimes they'll express them crudely, sometimes perhaps not so crudely. In terms of social media, it has without question created a much more messy situation, which is good in the sense of you want to communicate with larger numbers of people. If you run for office, you know how to use social media, you're not going to get elected. But if you're talking about influencing opinion in Washington, unless you're talking about issues of votes, Jewish votes don't matter all that much anyway. They only matter in the state of Florida for all intents and purposes. That has to do with the vagaries of the Electoral College system. If you talk about the numbers of Jewish votes, I don't think leaders in Congress or in the White House are particularly impressed with that. They are impressed with the thoughtfulness of an argument being presented. And that's why I say there's a world of difference coming from an individual who may have something very important to say, who will be taken only as an individual, and organizations that purport to represent American Jewish public opinion in its thoughtful, constructive form. And in that respect, I gave the example last night, which was deeply influential upon me, but just to rehearse it for a second for those of you who weren't there, is Shamir government in 1990 wanted to have American guarantees for loans to resettle Soviet Jewish immigrants. The Bush administration was willing to provide it, with the proviso that the funds would not be used to resettle immigrants on the West Bank. Shamir rejected that, saying it's a humanitarian issue, not a political issue. I went to the AJC board meeting at the time. Cheryl may have been there as well. Left to myself, we would have said, well, we oppose West Bank settlements too. Therefore, the Bush administration is correct and Shamir is wrong. David argued very effectively that this is an organization that has particular influence in Washington. Therefore, it's not about how you or I may feel about West Bank settlements as individuals. It's what is the responsible position for a major Jewish organization to be taking before circles of power in Washington. That is not a position that is particularly popular on college campuses. I freely admit that. It sounds like the Jewish establishment is controlling Jewish public opinion. That's not the case when I say there's room for individual dissent. Express yourselves as individuals. But as organizational representatives, our responsibility is to say what is constructive in terms of Jewish politics and power inside Washington. So I think the distinction is very real. It's complicated by the things you mentioned, Michael, in terms of such a plethora of opinion. But Jewish political influence is not a matter of Jewish votes. Jews are less than 2% of the population. And again, they're found in states that are so blue to begin with that by and large, if you're a politician running for office, I don't think you should care all that much about how many Jews are voting for you. What you should care about is that so much of the political discourse in this country is led by Jews. That's something I'm quite proud about, namely that Jews are very influential on the intellectual level. Therefore, if you're a politician running for office, don't spend your time up at night worrying about Jewish votes, but do spend your time worrying at night, what is the Jewish community, Jewish intellectuals, Jewish thinkers, Jewish writers, and Jewish institutions? What do they think about where you're headed politically? So in that sense, I think the distinction is quite real, and it's guided a lot of my activities over many years. That said, again, don't confuse advocacy with education. If you try to reduce advocacy to political talking points, that's important, again, for the social media. It's important for the one-liners. But ultimately, there's no effective advocacy unless people are really rooted in the history, politics, and culture of the Middle East, and especially the history of Israel.
And that's very hard to do.
It doesn't come easily. It comes at a particular price, and it requires investment. One of the things I did over the last 15 years at HAC was we partnered with Brandeis University in terms of a seminar for college professors around the globe at this point.
It was great.
Courses on modern Israel.
Yep.
Cy Sims, if you will, is he's not our economic patron, but in many ways he was our lodestar. An educated consumer is our best customer. That's the real thrust of where Israel advocacy needs to go. Don't say that it's a function of talking points. Say that it is a function of well-educated people who are prepared to enter into the messy world of political advocacy.
I'll just make one extra comment. It's also the fact that we put a lot of money into this. It's the money. The money translates to power.
The point is well taken. We're not all that comfortable talking about it at times, but
but I brought it up even though it was like hard to get the words out of my mouth. But absolutely, it's an issue, right?
It's more than just an issue. It's a reality that democracies are expensive because elections are expensive. One of the implications of that is that the campaign finance reform laws that some politicians have been supporting will work against a strong U.S.-Israel relationship because it'll weaken pro-Israel advocacy.
Yep.
So pro-Israel advocacy is of enormous importance because it strengthens ties between the United States and Israel. And that's something we should never lose sight of. At the same time, let's realize what our responsibility is to our students, namely to provide them with real education and not with talking points.
Within the community, there's a feeling to some extent that the funders are skewing the discussion in a certain way, and that some of the younger Jews students feel like our opinions aren't being reflected because the machers are controlling the debate and shutting dissent down, not reflecting the full community. How do we make sure that money within the community isn't all that influences organizational discussion? And how do we demonstrate to students that we understand that they're facing a lot of pressures out there and we want to hear their voices and we want them to learn about Israel and make their own decisions rather than say, come into the community so we can make you advocates for Israel?
What is happening at JCRC as a federation system agency, of course, is that we recognize that we have to bring in our young leadership. And we have to recognize that we are dealing with a lot of the issues our young leaders in our college, not only the college students, but the 20s, the 30s. I mean, in New York, there's so many Jews that you're called young leadership until you're 50. By the way. So we're starting to look at issues like social justice reform, criminal justice. We're deeply involved in meeting with progressives. And now that COVID is gone, we'll be bringing, one of the things that we do is we bring elected officials to Israel. So we're dealing with the right wings of the party and most of the left that are willing to come with us. We've had discussions in person, for example, with AOC, who is an elected official in New York City, and we were the only Jewish organization that she was willing to speak to. And so we have opened up lines of communication, and we are bringing in many, many different areas of discussion. And we are also in the streets. We are looking to other constituents, to the Latino community, to the Black community, to the Asian community. What areas do we share of importance between them and us so that we can start dialogue on things that we both care about? So, for example, in Crown Heights, the issue of the lack of housing between the Black community and the Hasidic community, because it's becoming gentrified, we are at the table bringing the Black community and the Hasidim together so that they can discuss how do you deal with the issue of housing. So if we can talk to each other, let's say about housing, then there are other areas of interest that we all share that we can use to support each other.
Let me just say a larger thing about political culture inside the Jewish community. Contrary to what many young people may feel, that it's been done by the machers, by the establishment, by the people with money, there is enormous concern within Jewish institutional circles as to what young people are thinking. They're saying, will they be with us the next generation? Cheryl mentioned conversion earlier. Again, I venture to say most of the people who are deeply concerned about conversion today, their support for Israel remains rock solid. They're worried about when their daughter-in-law converts to Judaism, will their son, be as enthusiastic about it when he discovers that conversion is not recognized? So in that respect, there's enormous concern about the next generation and where it's going. My one problem with the Boxer article this morning was he states it almost categorically that those who dissent today will be the stalwarts of pro-Israel advocacy tomorrow. That is an incredible leap of faith that, frankly, even one of his colleagues at Brandeis, who's part of the School of Social Science that says basically don't worry about this too much, it's only a matter of aging, that as they get older, they'll become more pro-Israel. Ted Sasson at Brandeis, who's very much a part of that team, said the one exception is mixed marriage. The more mixed marriage you have, the greater the distancing from Israel, for some of the reasons we've spoken about, particularly assimilation. And there is not only is there no guarantee that as mixed marrieds get older, they'll be more supportive of Israel. So far, all the evidence looks the other way, especially the Pew study that we discussed last night and has been widely reported in the media. So in that respect, there is enormous concern where the next generation is going. The response, I think, to Jewish organizations have taken to it, though, is twofold, and they go in two very different directions. Number one, create young leadership divisions. 50 sounds a bit old for it, but yes, Cheryl is quite correct. We often do go up to that age, in which basically training for future Jewish diplomats or Jewish advocates takes place. I've been less enthusiastic about that than I am about a different type of program that is fundamentally education. And the education goes in two very different directions. Number one is that without Judaism, so to speak, without coming to grips with Jewish materials and Jewish sources, the commitment to Israel is going to be much, much more attenuated. So first, you need an education program that is serious about Judaism. Second, it demonstrates its own integrity by being open to a variety of different points of view. And that, again, is part of the issue of young leadership is that, give them the necessary space and room to search, to look, to experiment, to hear from different people. I mentioned Stephen P. Cohen, late Stephen P. Cohen, earlier. I had a public debate with him at JTS a good number of years ago, in which he made the case that I briefly alluded to here, that American Jewish leaders retard the peace process or oppose the peace process. My response was fairly simple. I said, Professor Cohen, I don't hear the word Arab in your analysis. That you've given an analysis that says the fault lies entirely with the Jews. This was when Oslo was failing. Oslo failed because of Jewish opposition. How about Oslo failed because of continued Arab rejectionism? Now, that is the kind of exchange that I had with someone whom I agreed with very little on, but whom I respected as a key player. That open exchange, I think, was very helpful to JTS students, both on the high school level, the college level, and the rabbinical school level. How much do we see of that in terms of our concern with young people? There, I think your complaint is much more valid. Namely, it's not that we say, yes, we control the money, therefore we're the machers, therefore we have the view. What we are saying is that if you really want to engage these issues, become well educated with them. And in that respect, one of the things that was depressing that Cheryl mentioned earlier is how few American Jews could give correct answers to some of the most basic questions regarding Israel literacy. The AJC poll that was released this week indicated that 48% of younger American Jews could identify David Ben-Gurion as the first prime minister of Israel. Now, that's hardly an issue that's complicated. You can have a serious, complicated discussion of Ben-Gurion's policies. But the fact of being prime minister of Israel is not exactly an abstruse or recondite matter. Yet the paucity of people who are acquainted with that makes for a very weakened pro-Israel community.
15, 30 seconds or less for each of you. To what extent has the Jewish community failed to maintain the bipartisan outreach on our part? Cheryl, you talked about AOC. Have we followed Netanyahu's lead and skewed to one side instead of maintaining both? And if we have, can we get it back?
No, we have not skewed. I don't think so. I think most people were horrified about the politicization of Netanyahu and his vote Republican message and his insistence on speaking to Congress when we just were horrified by all of that.
Steve, 10 seconds.
10 seconds. Cheryl is absolutely correct regarding the prime minister. The qualification I would just add is that the bipartisanship presupposed a strong Orthodox community that would tilt politically conservative and a strong liberal non-Orthodox community that would tilt in a more pro-democratic capital D direction. That bipartisanship was essential. What we've seen is that Orthodox Jews have become more intense in their relationship with Israel. As they become more intense, that relationship has become much more partisan from their part because of their affinity with the Republican Party. In terms of the non-Orthodox movements, the drifting away from commitment to Israel, for all the reasons we've mentioned, means that the bulwarks of Jews within the Democratic Party have been less involved, less committed. That's a cause for concern. The prime minister aggravated this a great deal without question. But the drifting apart was there before the prime minister took office. And for reasons that had to do with the political culture within the American Jewish community, with Orthodoxy heading in one direction and the liberal movements heading in another direction. So I would suggest that's a perfect area for nuance and complications, not for Twitter.
Steve and Cheryl, thank you very much. One thing I'd like people to take away is to think about the importance of continuity in the American Jewish community and how Israel education is the crucial element that prevents Israel advocacy from actually endangering that continuity in some way.